The cold, polished gleam of Aurelia's marble floor was a universe away from the cracked linoleum in Alara's fifth-floor walk-up. Here, under chandeliers that dripped light like frozen honey, the clink of silverware against porcelain was a delicate symphony. At home, the sound was the rattle of her grandmother's pill bottle, a rhythm of survival. At 21, Ilara lived a life of jarring contrasts, a tightrope walker balancing between two worlds that should never have touched. Tonight, the air in Aurelia was thicker than usual, charged with the electric hum of New York City's 1%. Ilara moved through it like a ghost in her starched black uniform, her face a mask of serene professionalism she'd spent 3 years perfecting. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of due dates and medical bills. A paper on identifying forged hallmarks on 18th century Russian silver was due Friday. Her grandmother, Maeve, needed a refill of the heart medication that cost more than Alara's weekly take-home pay. So she smiled, she poured, she cleared, and she became invisible. It was a skill, one she had honed through sheer necessity. To be a good waitress in a place like Aurelia was to be an absence, a silent facilitator of pleasure for people who believed their comfort was an inalienable right. But tonight, 2 tables shattered her invisibility. At table 7, nestled in a plush velvet booth, sat a man who radiated a quiet, gravitational pull. He was alone, dressed in a bespoke suit the color of a midnight sky, no tie. He hadn't looked at his phone once. Instead, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room, not with the predatory gaze of a mogul on the hunt, but with the focused calm of an assessor. He was black, perhaps in his early 40s, and he carried an aura of power that was earned, not inherited. It was in the set of his jaw, the deliberate way he lifted his water glass. He'd ordered the tasting menu, and with each course Ilara served, he offered a quiet, genuine, "Thank you," meeting her eyes for a brief, respectful moment. Ilara found herself unconsciously straightening her spine a little taller when she approached his table. Then there was table 12, the epicenter of a vortex of noise and entitlement. Richard Sterling, a third-generation real estate leech whose face was a permanent fixture in the society pages, held court. His face was a fleshy pink testament to a life devoid of hardship, his voice a bray that sliced through the restaurant's curated ambiance. With him were his skeletal girlfriend Chantal, whose laughter sounded like glass breaking, and a sycophantic crony named Todd. They were the kind of patrons who snapped their fingers, who sent back a perfectly cooked steak, claiming it was psychologically underdone, who treated Ilara not as a person, but as a function. "Girl," Sterling had barked the moment she approached. Not miss, not excuse me. "Girl," the word was a slap. "Get us another bottle of the Pétrus, and be quick about it. My throat is as dry as your future." Chantal and Todd had roared with laughter. Ilara had just smiled, a small, tight curve of her lips. "Of course, sir. Right away." For 2 hours, the abuse was a steady, dripping faucet of humiliation. Sterling complained about the temperature of the butter. Chantal held her wineglass up to the light and declared she saw a microscopic flaw, demanding a new one. Todd made a crude comment about the fit of Ilara's uniform. With each insult, Ilara felt a piece of her armor chip away, exposing the raw nerve of her exhaustion and anxiety. She could feel the eyes of other diners on her, a mixture of pity and discomfort. She could also feel the gaze of the man at table 7, but his was different. It wasn't pity, it was evaluation. The manager, a perpetually sweating man named Mr. Davies, fluttered around Sterling's table, offering obsequious apologies and complimentary digestives. He never once looked at Ilara, never once offered a word of support. In the brutal calculus of high-end service, a whale like Richard Sterling was worth more than the dignity of a dozen waitstaff. Ilara's mind drifted to the worn armchair in her apartment, where a stack of library books waited for her. In their pages, she wasn't an invisible girl. She was a scholar, a detective of history. She could spot the subtle inconsistencies in an enamel finish, the telltale signs of modern tools on a piece of supposedly antique silver. She could tell a genuine Fabergé egg from a masterful replica by the quality of the guilloche work under the enamel. That was her world, a place of logic, beauty, and truth. It was the only thing that made this world, the world of Sterling's contempt, bearable. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, a soft Irish lilt that had never lost its melody. Your eyes are a gift, Alara. You see what others miss. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for it. Alara took a deep breath, centered herself, and picked up a fresh bread basket. Just a few more hours. A few more hours, and she could go home, brew a cup of chamomile tea for Maeve, and lose herself in the intricate world of Carl Fabergé's workmasters. Just a few more hours, but she felt a prickle of dread on the back of her neck, a cold premonition that tonight was different. The quiet man at table 7 was still watching, and the storm at table 12 was far from over. It was building, coiling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was standing directly in its path. Freeze, did you just feel that? That's the feeling of a collision course being set. The story you think you're about to read is about a rich bully and a poor waitress. It's not. This is the story of how a hidden skill, forged in dusty library stacks and fueled by a grandmother's love, becomes a weapon in a war of class and character. Witness the moment a 21-year-old waitress, armed with nothing but her intellect, systematically dismantles a real estate mogul in front of New York's elite. See the face of Julian Vance, the silent observer, as he realizes the young woman serving his sea bass isn't just a waitress, she's the sharpest mind in the room. But here's the twist that will make your blood run cold. Mr. Vance isn't just a diner with a front row seat. He's the shadow owner of the entire restaurant group, and he's been looking for a reason to clean house. Richard Sterling isn't just about to ruin Alara's night. He's about to hand Julian Vance the sword he needs to gut the whole rotten system. Prepare yourself. The main course is about to be served, and it's a dish of justice, served ice cold. The tension at table 12 escalated with the arrival of the cheese course. Richard Sterling, his face flushed with wine and self-importance, decided to unveil the evening's pièce de résistance. He reached into his jacket pocket and, with the dramatic flair of a cheap magician, produced a small, ornate object. It was an egg, no larger than a robin's, crafted from what appeared to be gold and opalescent white enamel, studded with tiny seed pearls. He placed it on the crisp white tablecloth with a theatrical thud. A recent acquisition, he announced, his voice booming across the hushed dining room. A little trinket, a genuine work by Fyodor Ruckert. He let the name hang in the air, a bauble for his companions to admire. Pre-revolution. Survived the Bolsheviks, can you imagine? Worth more than this entire restaurant, I'd wager. Chantal and Todd cooed with predictable awe. Alara, approaching to clear their plates, couldn't help but glance at the object, and in that glance her world shifted. Her mind, so attuned to the nuances of Russian decorative arts, went into overdrive. It was like a perfectly tuned instrument hearing a sour note. Fyodor Ruckert, she thought, her hands momentarily freezing over a plate. No. Ruckert's plique azure enamel work was legendary, almost liquid in its translucence. This egg's enamel was flat, opaque, like cheap nail polish. Ruckert favored shaded enamel, a difficult technique that gave his work a painterly quality. This was a single uniform shade, and the pearl, they were too perfectly spherical, a sign of modern cultivation, not the slightly irregular river pearls used in the period. She saw a microscopic scratch near the base, revealing a glint of brassy metal beneath the thin gold plating. It was a fake, a gaudy, poorly made one at that, the kind of thing sold to tourists with more money than sense in a back alley shop in Brighton Beach. A wave of nausea and something akin to pity washed over her. This man, so desperate to project an image of immense wealth and taste, was flaunting a cheap knockoff. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Something amusing, girl? Sterling's voice was a whip crack. Alara snapped back to the present. He had caught her looking, a flicker of an expression on her face. No, sir, not at all. It's, very striking. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. He smirked, mollified. Striking doesn't begin to cover it. It's a piece of history, something you wouldn't understand. She simply nodded and continued clearing the table, her movements deft and silent. But the image of the fraudulent egg was seared into her brain. It felt like an omen, a lie sitting bold as brass in the center of the table. Meanwhile, at table 7, Julian Vance watched the entire exchange. He hadn't heard the details, but he saw the girl's momentary pause. He saw the flicker of, what was it? Recognition? Contempt? He saw Sterling's peacocking, the way he used the object to command attention. Julian had grown up in a 3-room apartment in the Bronx, the son of a transit worker and a seamstress. He'd built his tech empire, Vance Systems, from nothing but code and sheer will. He knew the difference between the quiet confidence of real power and the noisy insecurity of inherited wealth. Richard Sterling was the latter, a walking, talking billboard of inadequacy. Julian had been considering a majority stake acquisition in the hospitality group that owned Aurelia. He'd come tonight, unannounced, to gauge the restaurant's soul. He'd seen impeccable service and culinary artistry, but he'd also seen the terrified deference of Mr. Davies and the blatant abuse heaped on the young waitress. A business, he believed, was only as strong as its most vulnerable employee. And from what he could see, Aurelia was rotting from the inside out with a culture of fear. He watched Alara as she moved through the room. He noticed the slight wear on her black shoes, meticulously polished but undeniably old. He saw the faint stain of ink on her right index finger, the mark of a student. He saw the way she carried herself, a straight-back dignity that seemed to defy the constant barrage of insults from table 12. He'd been about to write off the investment, concluding the brand's culture was too toxic to salvage. But something about this young woman gave him pause. There was a resilience there, a fire banked low but not extinguished. The evening wore on. Dessert was served, coffee was poured. Sterling grew louder, more belligerent. He made a crass joke about Alara's tip, suggesting she'd have to work for it. Todd guffawed, spraying a fine mist of espresso across the table. Chantal wrinkled her nose in disgust and glared at Alara as if it were her fault. Alara felt her composure fraying at the edges. Her smile was a Herculean effort. All she wanted was to be home, the scent of old paper and Maeve's lavender sachets chasing the stench of Sterling's cologne from her nostrils. She presented the bill, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. Sterling snatched the leather folder. He glanced at the total, then back at the fake egg still sitting on the table. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey. He looked at Chantal, then at Todd, a silent, cruel communication passing between them. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. The storm was about to break. "Well, well, well," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, menacing purr. He tapped a manicured finger on the fraudulent egg. "It seems we have a problem. A very, very expensive problem." He raised his eyes and pinned Alara with a look of pure malice. "My trinket," he said, his voice suddenly rising to fill the room. "It's been damaged. There's a scratch on it that wasn't there before." Every head in the dining room turned. The gentle music seemed to fade away. Mr. Davies began power walking towards their table, his face a mask of panic. Sterling stood up, his bulk casting a shadow over Alara. "And I know exactly who did it." He pointed a thick accusatory finger directly at her face. "It was you, the clumsy waitress. You probably knocked it with a plate when you were manhandling the dishes." The accusation was so absurd, so patently false that for a second Alara could only stare. The scratch she had noticed earlier, the one that revealed the cheap metal underneath? He was using it against her. "Sir, I assure you I was extremely careful," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. "Don't lie to me," he roared. The entire restaurant was now an audience to his performance. "This is a priceless artifact. You've probably taken thousands off its value. You'll be hearing from my lawyers. In fact, you'll be hearing from the police. This is destruction of property." Mr. Davies arrived, breathless and sweating. "Mr. Sterling, sir, please. What seems to be the trouble? I'm sure we can sort this out." "Sort it out," Sterling scoffed. "Your incompetent staffer just damaged a museum-quality piece. I want her fired, now, and I want this restaurant to cover the cost of the damages, all of it." Mr. Davies turned to Alara, his eyes holding no sympathy, only frantic damage control. "Alara, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "I never touched it. The scratch was already there when he placed it on the table." Are you calling my client a liar? Chantal shrieked, her voice thin and piercing. She is, Todd chimed in. The audacity! The scene was spiraling into a nightmare. Ilara felt trapped, cornered. She looked around for help, but the other staff members were staring at their shoes. The other diners were watching with rapt, horrified attention. Her gaze fell on table 7, on the quiet man who had been watching all night. His face was unreadable, his expression a calm, impenetrable mask. For a heartbreaking moment, she thought he was just another spectator, enjoying the show. Then he slowly, deliberately folded his napkin and placed it on the table beside his plate. It was a small gesture, but it was one of finality. The assessment was over. A decision had been made. Richard Sterling, drunk on power and emboldened by the manager's cowardice, went a step further. He decided to deliver the killing blow. You know what? He sneered, his eyes glittering with a vicious idea. I bet she didn't just scratch it. I bet she was trying to steal it. A poor little thing like you. An object this valuable must be so tempting. Let's check her pockets. Let's check her apron. Before Ilara could react, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like claws. Let's see what you're hiding, you little thief. A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer just humiliation. It was assault. Ilara's mind went blank with shock and fear. Her training, her professionalism, it all evaporated, leaving only a terrified 21-year-old girl. Let go of me, she whispered, struggling against his grip. Not until we see what you've stolen, he snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with wine. And that was the moment the quiet man at table 7 finally moved. If you're feeling the rage building in your chest, you need to subscribe right now. Because the justice that is coming for Richard Sterling is not swift and simple. It's a slow, methodical, intellectual execution. Ilara is about to do something no one expects, and Julian Vance is about to unleash a storm of consequences that will redefine what it means to be powerful. How would you react if you saw a woman being physically assaulted in public? Let me know in the comments, because Julian Vance's next move will not only save Ilara, it will change her life forever. Take your hand off her. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the dining room with the sharp, chilling authority of a judge's gavel. It carried no heat, no anger, only an absolute, unyielding command. Richard Sterling froze, his hand still clamped on Ilara's arm. He turned, his face a mask of indignant rage, to find Julian Vance standing beside the table. He was no longer a quiet observer. His presence seemed to fill the space, his calm a stark and terrifying contrast to Sterling's blustering fury. And who the hell are you? Sterling spat, though his grip on Ilara loosened slightly. Her boyfriend? Sticking up for your little ghetto girlfriend? Julian's eyes, which had been calm moments before, hardened into chips of obsidian, but his voice remained unnervingly level. I am a guest in this restaurant who is watching you assault a member of the staff. Let her go. Now. There was a moment of tense silence as the two men stared each other down. Sterling, fueled by arrogance and a lifetime of getting his way, was not accustomed to being challenged. But there was something in the other man's gaze, an utter lack of fear, a promise of consequences that made a seed of doubt sprout in his wine-soaked brain. He released Ilara's arm with a contemptuous shove. Ilara stumbled back, rubbing the angry red marks his fingers had left on her skin. She looked at her rescuer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mr. Davies scurried forward, desperate to regain control. Sir, thank you, but I have this handled. Mr. Sterling is a valued customer. Your valued customer just physically assaulted an employee, Julian interrupted, his gaze never leaving Sterling, and falsely accused her of theft and property damage in front of a room full of witnesses. I wouldn't call that handled, Mr. Davies. The use of his name sent a visible jolt through the manager. Who was this man? Sterling, recovering his bluster, sneered. This doesn't concern you, pal. This is between me, this little thief, and the restaurant that's going to pay for what she did to my property. He gestured grandly to the fake egg on the table. That is a priceless Fyodor Ruckert original, and this girl damaged it. And then something inside Ilara snapped. It wasn't a loud, violent break, but a quiet, decisive click. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. It was the anger of a scholar witnessing an insult to her field. It was the righteous fury of an honest person being called a thief. It was the exhaustion of a young woman who was done being treated as less than human. Her grandmother's words echoed in her ears. You see what others miss. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for it. She took a step forward. Her voice when she spoke was clear and steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued her all evening. No, it isn't. All eyes turned to her. Sterling looked at her as if she were an insect that had just learned to talk. What did you just say? I said no, it isn't, Alara repeated, her gaze fixed on the gaudy trinket. It's not a Theodore Ruckert original. It's not priceless. In fact, I doubt it's worth more than the bottle of wine you just drank. A stunned silence fell over the room. Chantal's jaw dropped. Todd looked utterly bewildered. Sterling's face began to purple with rage. How dare you? What would a little nobody like you know about Russian antiquities? This was her world. This was her ground. Her fear was gone. She met his gaze without flinching. I know that Fyodor Ruckert was a master of shaded and plique-à-jour enamel. That egg has flat, opaque enamel that looks like it was painted on in a single coat. It's clumsy. She took another step closer, her voice gaining confidence with every word. I know that the pearls he used were natural river pearls, which have slight irregularities. The ones on that egg are perfectly spherical, which means they're modern cultured pearls, probably from a freshwater farm in China. She pointed a finger at the object, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. I know that Ruckert worked primarily in silver gilt, not gold-plated brass. I could see the brass underneath the cheap plating from 5 feet away, from the scratch that you falsely accused me of making. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was giving a lecture. She was dissecting his lie with the precision of a scholar. And most importantly, she said, delivering the final devastating blow, I know that Fyodor Ruckert's maker's mark is FR in Cyrillic. The mark on the bottom of that egg, which I saw when you lifted it, is a clumsy imitation, and it's stamped, not engraved. It's a fake, and it's not even a good one. The entire restaurant was utterly silent, hanging on her every word. Richard Sterling stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. He had been so sure of his power, of his ability to crush this insignificant girl. But she had just eviscerated him, not with an emotional outburst, but with cold, hard, undeniable facts. She had used her knowledge, the very thing he'd belittled, to expose him as a fraud in front of his peers. Julian Vance watched her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time all evening. He had thought he was coming to scout a business. He had found a diamond. Sterling, finally finding his voice, sputtered, That's ridiculous. You're making it all up. Am I? Ilara's voice was soft, but it held the strength of irrefutable truth. There's a world-renowned appraiser, Dr. Alistair Finch, whose office is 3 blocks from here. Let's call him. Let's have him come down and take a look. Or we could call the police, as you suggested. I'm sure they have experts who can spot a forgery. The color drained from Sterling's face. He knew he was caught. In his desperate attempt to humiliate a waitress, he had exposed his own pathetic secret. He snatched the egg from the table and shoved it into his pocket. This is preposterous. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by the help. He glared at Mr. Davies. I'm never setting foot in this pathetic excuse for a restaurant again. He turned to leave, grabbing Chantal's arm. But Julian Vance took a calm step forward, blocking his path. Not just yet, Mr. Sterling, Julian said, his voice once again quiet but imbued with immense weight. You still owe me an apology. An apology to you? Sterling scoffed. No, Julian said. He gestured towards Alara. To her. The air crackled. The final showdown was here. Sterling, cornered and humiliated, versus the young woman he had tried to destroy. Apologize to this nobody? He spat. I would rather die. That can be arranged, Julian replied, the words so devoid of emotion they were more terrifying than any threat. But let's try the apology first. However, before you do, allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Julian Vance. I am the founder and CEO of Vance Systems. A murmur went through the room. Vance Systems was a titan of the tech industry. Julian Vance was a legend, a self-made billionaire known for his brilliance and his ruthlessness in business. Sterling's eyes widened in dawning horror. He had just tried to bully a waitress in front of one of the most powerful men in the country, but Julian wasn't finished. He let the silence hang for a beat before delivering the final, crushing blow. And as of 3 months ago, my private equity firm acquired a 60% controlling interest in the restaurant group that owns Aurelia. Which means, Mr. Davies, he said, turning his cold gaze on the trembling manager, that I am your boss. And Mr. Sterling, he turned back, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. You are standing in my restaurant, abusing my employee. The aftermath of this revelation will be more satisfying than you can possibly imagine. Subscribe now, because the firings are just the beginning. The life-altering offer Julian Vance is about to make to Alara, and the slow, public dismantling of Richard Sterling's world will restore your faith that sometimes the good guys don't just win, they triumph. The shockwave from Julian Vance's revelation rolled through Aurelia, leaving a stunned and absolute silence in its wake. Mr. Davies looked as though he might faint, his face the color of spoiled milk. Richard Sterling's bravado finally, completely crumbled, replaced by the pale, clammy fear of a man who has just realized he picked a fight with a god. Now, Julian said, his voice calm and methodical, as if he were discussing a quarterly earnings report. Let's review the events of the evening. You, Mr. Sterling, subjected my employee to 2 hours of verbal abuse. You then falsely accused her of damaging your property. You followed that with a false accusation of theft, and you culminated your performance by physically assaulting her. All of this has been witnessed by no less than 50 people, many of whom, I notice, have been recording on their phones. A sea of phones which had been subtly filming were now held aloft with defiant pride. The businessman at the table next to Julian's gave him a sharp, approving nod. Julian's gaze shifted to the manager. Mr. Davies, you stood by and allowed this to happen. You offered no support to your employee. You did not de-escalate the situation. In fact, you were prepared to sacrifice her to placate this bully. You have failed in your most basic duties as a manager, to protect your staff and maintain a safe environment for all guests. Your employment here is terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Mr. Davies opened his mouth, but no words came out. He simply wilted, a man defeated. 2 of the restaurant's burly security guards, who had been hovering near the entrance, moved forward with grim purpose. Then Julian turned his full attention back to Sterling. As for you, you will apologize to Ms. He paused, turning to Alara with a look of genuine inquiry. Voss, she supplied, her voice quiet but clear. Alara Voss. You will apologize to Ms. Voss for your behavior, for your accusations, and for putting your hands on her. You will do it now, and you will do it loud enough for everyone in this room to hear. Sterling was trapped. The eyes of every person in the room were on him. His reputation, his entire world built on the flimsy scaffolding of public perception, was teetering on the brink of collapse. He looked at Alara, his face a twisted mask of humiliation and hatred. He mumbled something under his breath. I'm sorry, Julian said politely. I couldn't hear that. I believe Ms. Voss deserves to hear it clearly. Sterling swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Alara, and through gritted teeth he forced the words out. I apologize. For? Julian prompted gently. For the misunderstanding, Sterling ground out. Alara looked at this broken, pathetic man and felt nothing but a vast, weary emptiness. Julian, however, was not satisfied. There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling. You were malicious and you were wrong. Try again. Sterling's face was now slick with sweat. He knew he had no choice. I apologize for my accusations, he said, his voice cracking, and for my behavior. Good, Julian said with an air of finality. Now get out of my restaurant. You and anyone associated with you are permanently banned from all of my properties. If you ever speak to or approach Ms. Voss again, I will bring the full weight of my legal resources down on you so hard you will spend the rest of your life selling fake eggs out of a trench coat. The threat was delivered with such surgical precision that Chantal let out a small squeak of terror. Without another word, Sterling, flanked by his now silent companions, turned and practically fled the restaurant, a gauntlet of cold stares and raised cell phones following his every step. The moment they were gone, a spontaneous round of applause broke. The applause broke over Ilara like a rogue wave, a disorienting crash of sound in a room that had, moments before, been a crucible of her humiliation. It was a surreal noise, warm and supportive, yet it made her flinch. Diners, their faces a gallery of empathy and vicarious triumph, were on their feet. An elderly woman, her neck adorned with a rope of pearls that shone with the deep, creamy luster of the genuine article, moved towards her. The woman's eyes, clouded by age but sharp with kindness, met Ilara's. She pressed a crisp, folded $100 bill into Ilara's trembling hand. "For your education, dear," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery rustle. "You are a remarkable young woman." Ilara could only manage a choked sob, the tears she had held back for hours finally spilling over, hot and stinging. It wasn't the money or even the applause. It was the acknowledgement. It was the simple, profound fact that she had stood her ground, had spoken her truth into a void of contempt, and for the first time in her life, someone powerful had not only listened, but had stood with her. Julian Vance waited, a bastion of calm in the emotional storm, allowing the moment to crest and settle. When the room had quieted, his voice, though pitched low, carried to every corner. "The restaurant will close for the evening. All staff will be paid for their full shift and given an additional bonus for their professionalism under duress. All of our guest meals tonight are, of course, complimentary." A final, appreciative smatter of clapping followed the announcement. He then turned to Ilara. The formidable CEO, the titan who had just dismantled 3 lives with surgical precision, seemed to recede, leaving in his place a man whose gaze was unexpectedly gentle, almost searching. "Ms. Voss," he began, the formality a strange counterpoint to the intimacy of the moment. "May I have a word with you in private?" Numbness had begun to creep into her limbs, a protective sheath against the adrenaline that still sang through her veins. She nodded, the motion jerky, and led him wordlessly through the swinging doors, past the shell-shocked kitchen staff, to a small, cluttered office behind the dry goods pantry. The air inside was thick with the scent of invoices and stale coffee. He closed the door, muffling the sounds of the restaurant shutting down, creating a sudden, profound quiet. He gestured to the single-worn office chair. "Please." He didn't sit, but leaned against the edge of a metal desk, his posture creating a deliberate, non-threatening distance between them. "First," he said, his voice stripped of its public authority, now quiet and sincere, "I need to apologize to you, not as the owner of this establishment, but as a human being. What you endured tonight was unacceptable. The fact that it happened in a company I own represents a systemic failure, a culture of fear that I have clearly allowed to fester. It's a failure of my leadership, and I intend to correct it. But the apology is personal. I am sorry." The directness of it, the complete ownership of responsibility, disarmed her. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered, twisting the damp napkin in her hands. "You weren't here. You didn't know. A good leader makes it his business to know," he countered softly, a flicker of self-reproach in his eyes. "But that is my problem to solve. What I want to talk about is you. What you did in there, it was extraordinary. You were cornered, assaulted, and you responded not with rage but with intellect. You defended your honor with your expertise. That kind of grace under fire, that is a weapon few people possess." He paused, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were examining a complex equation. "You spoke about your studies, Russian decorative arts." The mention of her true passion was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. Ilara found her voice, a little stronger this time. "Yes, I'm in my final year of an art history degree at Columbia. My focus is on authentication and provenance research, specifically the workshops of the Russian Imperial Court, Fabergé, Bolin, Ruckert." A slow, deeply impressed smile touched Julian's lips. It transformed his face, erasing the last vestiges of the ruthless executive. "I see. Ilara, may I ask you a question? What is your 5-year plan?" The question was so jarringly corporate, so utterly alien to the reality of her life, that she could only stare at him. My plan? Yes. In 5 years, where do you want to be? What does your life look like? An image flashed through her mind. The stack of overdue bills on her tiny kitchen table, the calendar marked with Maeve's next dozen doctor's appointments, the looming specter of student loan repayments. A 5-year plan was a luxury reserved for people who weren't living in 5-minute increments. The raw, unvarnished truth spilled out of her, carried on a tide of exhaustion and despair. Honestly, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, I'm just trying to make it to Friday. My grandmother Maeve, she raised me. She's sick, her heart, the medication, the specialists, it's a lot. I take care of her. I work 40 hours here. I study until 3 in the morning. I write papers on the subway. The plan? The plan is just to survive, to keep her comfortable, to graduate without being crushed by debt. That's as far as I can see. The honesty of her answer hung in the small office, stark and heavy. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, and Alara felt a flush of shame, as if she had revealed too much, exposed the messy, desperate mechanics of her life to this man of impossible success. I'm going to make you an offer, Alara, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. And I want you to listen to the entire thing before you respond. This is not charity. Let me be very clear about that. Charity is an emotional act. This is a strategic one. It's an investment. He straightened up from the desk, his focus absolute, his energy filling the small room. The Vance Foundation, my philanthropic arm, operates a significant arts and antiquities division. We manage one of the largest private collections of Russian objets d'art outside of the Hermitage. We are constantly acquiring new pieces, and we are constantly battling a tide of increasingly sophisticated forgeries. We need people with your exact skill set, people with an unerring eye, a rigorous mind, and, most importantly, unimpeachable character. He took a slow breath, his eyes locked on hers. Effective immediately, I want you to come work for the foundation. We will begin by paying off your existing student loan debt in its entirety. It will be gone by the end of the week. We will then fund the remainder of your university education, tuition and living expenses, up to and including your doctorate, should you choose to pursue it. You will start as a salaried research associate in our authentication department under the direct mentorship of Dr. Lena Petrova. She is quite simply the best in the world. Your starting salary will be triple what you make here, with full medical benefits for you and your grandmother. You will have access to our entire collection. Your only job will be to learn, to study, and to become the expert I already know you are. Alara's mind reeled. The words were English, but they didn't compute. It was a litany of impossibilities, a fantasy so audacious she had never even allowed herself to dream it. It was like being handed the keys to a kingdom she never knew existed. The room seemed to tilt, the scent of coffee and paper fading into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Why? The word was a faint puff of air, the only sound she could make. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. Julian Vance's expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of a memory, a shadow of a different life. Because, Alara, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet, powerful conviction, my mother was a seamstress. She worked out of our apartment in the Bronx, her fingers raw from the needles, just to keep us fed. She had a designer's eye. She could see the architecture of a dress in a bolt of cloth. She had immense talent, but she never had an opportunity. The world is full of talent. It is starving for opportunity. Integrity, however, is the rarest commodity on earth. Tonight, I saw a woman who possessed both in abundance, and I will not stand by and watch that be squandered. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. I am not giving you a handout. I am making an investment in human capital. This will be the hardest work you have ever done. Dr. Petrova will test you until you think you will break. But I have a feeling that you, Alara Voss, are going to be one of the best investments I ever make. He held out a sleek, black business card. My assistant's direct line is on there. She will call you tomorrow morning at 9 to begin the arrangements. Go home. Get some rest. Elara numbly took the card. The thick stock was cool against her skin, the engraved letters sharp beneath her fingertips. It was the only thing that felt real. The man at table 7 hadn't just saved her night. He had just detonated her entire life, and in the rubble he was offering to help her build an empire. The subway ride home was a study in jarring contrasts. The screech of the train's wheels against the tracks, the smell of damp concrete, the weary, vacant faces of the late-night commuters. It was the raw, familiar texture of her world. Yet in her pocket, the business card felt like a hot coal, a relic from another dimension. She kept touching it through the thin fabric of her coat, a talisman against the encroaching fear that she had dreamt the entire encounter. Had it really happened? The humiliation from Sterling was real enough. She could still feel the phantom grip of his fingers on her arm. But the offer that followed, it felt like a fever dream, a desperate fantasy cooked up by a mind at its breaking point. When she finally turned the key in the lock of her apartment, the scent of lavender and old paper wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. The small living room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting a warm glow on the towering stacks of books and the worn floral armchair where Maeve was asleep. A half-finished cup of chamomile tea on the table beside her. Her grandmother's breathing was a soft, rhythmic whisper, a sound that had been the backdrop to Elara's entire life. This was her reality. This was what she had been fighting for. She gently touched Maeve's shoulder. Her grandmother startled awake, her faded blue eyes blinking in confusion before focusing on Elara's face. "Oh, Mo Crowe," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep and a faint Irish lilt. "You're late. Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." And in that moment, the dam broke. Sitting on the floor by her grandmother's chair, Elara recounted the entire night, the words tumbling out in a torrent of remembered fear, anger, and dawning disbelief. She spoke of Sterling's cruelty, of Mr. Davies's cowardice, of the terrifying moment she thought she would lose everything. And then she told her about the quiet man at table 7, the revelation of his identity, and the impossible, life-altering offer. Maeve listened, her hand stroking Elara's hair, her expression shifting from horror to righteous anger, and finally to a fierce, incandescent pride that made her eyes shine with tears. When Elara finished, placing the business card in her grandmother's frail, wrinkled hand, Maeve was silent for a long time. "When you were a little girl," Maeve said at last, her voice raspy with emotion, "you would spend hours at the museum, your nose pressed against the glass of the jewelry cases. You didn't see shiny things. You saw history. You saw the hands that made them. You told me you could hear the stories they were trying to tell. I knew then. I knew your eyes were a gift from God." She closed her hand around the card. "This, Elara, this isn't a handout. This isn't charity. This is the world finally paying you what you are worth. It's an inheritance you have earned with your own mind." The first day at the Vance Foundation was more terrifying than facing down Richard Sterling. The building was a silent, steel and glass monolith on Park Avenue that seemed to inhale the sky. The lobby was a cavern of white marble, the air chilled to a precise temperature and smelling faintly of money and floor polish. The click of her best, but still worn, shoes echoed with embarrassing clarity. She felt like a fraud, a waitress in a borrowed blazer, waiting to be discovered and ejected. Dr. Lena Petrova was a formidable woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a severe chignon and eyes the color of a winter sky. She did not smile. She surveyed Elara from behind a vast, uncluttered mahogany desk in an office lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. "Mr. Vance is a man of enthusiasms," Dr. Petrova said, her accent a crisp St. Petersburg staccato that made every word sound like a final judgment. "You are his latest. He believes you have a raw, intuitive talent. I, however, believe only in discipline, rigor, and scholarship. Intuition is a parlor trick for amateurs." She gestured to a small table in the corner, upon which sat a single object, a silver cigarette case decorated with blue guilloche enamel. "Tell me about this piece." It was a test. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She picked it up, her hand surprisingly steady. She ran her fingers over the surface, her mind going quiet, shutting out the intimidating office and the hawk-like gaze of the woman watching her. She pulled the jeweler's loupe Mr. Vance's assistant had provided from her bag and brought it to her eye. The world shrank to the magnified landscape of enamel and silver. She spent 10 minutes in complete silence, turning the object over and over. She examined the hinge, the clasp, the quality of the enamel, the maker's mark stamped on the inner lip. "It's beautiful," Ilara said finally, her voice low and focused. "The enamel work is first-rate, consistent with the Fabergé workshop under workmaster Henrik Wigström. The mark HW in the 88 Zlotnik silver standard are correct for the period around 1910. Dr. Petrova's expression remained unchanged. "And?" Ilara took a deep breath. "And it's a fake, an exceptionally good one." A single perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose on Dr. Petrova's forehead. "Explain." "The guilloche," Ilara said, her confidence growing as she entered her element. "The engine-turned pattern beneath the enamel. It's too perfect. The lathes used in Wigström's time had minute, almost imperceptible irregularities from the craftsman's hand pressure. This pattern is mathematically flawless, which suggests it was made with a modern, computer-controlled lathe. And the hinge, the pin is a fraction of a millimeter too wide. It's a modern construction, made to look old." She put the case down gently. It was made to deceive, but it was made by a machine, not a master. Dr. Petrova was silent for a full minute, her wintry eyes boring into Ilara. Then a slow, thin smile touched her lips. It was not a warm smile, but it was a smile of respect. "Mr. Vance's enthusiasms," she said, "are occasionally correct. Welcome to the Foundation, Ms. Voss. Your education begins now. Do not be late again." The months that followed were a blur of grueling, exhilarating work. Dr. Petrova was a merciless teacher, pushing Ilara harder than she had ever been pushed. Her days were spent in archives that smelled of centuries-old paper, in conservation labs under the glare of unforgiving lights, and in libraries surrounded by mountains of reference books. She learned about metallurgy, the subtle chemistry of enamel pigments, the history of gemstone cutting. Her life became a tapestry of hallmarks, provenance records, and auction catalogs. There were nights she fell into bed in her new, sunlit apartment, an apartment with an elevator and a spare room for Maeve's art supplies, so exhausted she couldn't even dream. But it was a different kind of exhaustion. It wasn't the soul-crushing weariness of balancing survival. It was the satisfying ache of a mind being stretched to its limits. For the first time, she was not just surviving. She was building. The story of the waitress and the fake egg had, as Julian predicted, gone viral. Richard Sterling became a short-lived meme, a public caricature of entitled arrogance. A subsequent investigative article in the Times, prompted by the video, delved into his precarious real estate ventures, exposing a career built on bluff and intimidation. Confidence, the currency of his world, evaporated. His empire didn't collapse in a dramatic explosion. It simply dissolved, like sugar in water, leaving him a diminished, irrelevant figure. Ilara saw his photo once, months later, in a gossip blog. He looked puffy and lost. She felt nothing. He was a ghost from a life that was no longer hers. Almost a year to the day after that night at Aurelia, Julian Vance appeared at the door of her research office. She was no longer a nervous intern but a junior associate, preparing a report on a potential new acquisition. "Dr. Petrova tells me you saved us from spending 7 figures on a very convincing forgery of a Romanov-era brooch," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "The diamonds were laser drilled," Ilara replied, not looking up from her microscope. "A modern technique. They were trying to pass them off as old mine cuts." He smiled. "My investment continues to pay dividends." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to give you something." He slid a slim velvet box across her desk. Ilara opened it. Nestled inside was an egg, no larger than a robin's, crafted from silver gilt and the most exquisite, translucent lilac enamel she had ever seen, its surface shimmering over a wave-like guilloche pattern. It was studded with tiny seed pearls. "It's by Fyodor Ruckert," Julian said softly. "A genuine one. It's a gift." Ilara looked from the perfect, historical object to the man standing in her doorway. The gift wasn't just the egg. It was the closing of a circle, the replacing of a fraudulent, ugly memory with something true and beautiful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. "Ilara," he said, his expression serious, "the world is full of Richard Sterlings. They are loud and they seem powerful, but their power is a fragile shell, like that fake egg. True power is not the ability to humiliate. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth." He left her then, a silent titan moving through the empire he had built. Ilara picked up her loop, the familiar weight a comfort in her hand. She looked at the beautiful object before her, a piece of history, of truth, a testament to the hands of a master. She had not been rescued from her old life. She had earned her way into a new one, armed with the gifts she always possessed. Julian Vance had not been her savior. He had been a catalyst. He had opened a door that had always been there, waiting for her. She was the one who had found the courage to step through it, to claim the space that was rightfully hers. And she knew with a certainty that warmed her to her soul that she would never ever be invisible again.